That story explains me, but it doesn't define me.
Greg Shindler is a serial entrepreneur and the co-founder of Amara. He has built businesses across healthcare, regenerative medicine, and leadership.
He is 10 years sober,
A father of 3,
and he has spent most of his life working out what a story does to the person carrying it.
And I adapted to survive those events when they happened and after they happened. But I'm surviving something that is no longer happening. What am I unable to see? Because I'm so convinced that I'm already seeing clearly.
Hi, I'm Steve Support, and this is the Neuro's Journey. It's Wednesday, and we're back again to have another great conversation. We have Greg Shindler on today. So blessed to have you on, brother. And you know, your career is big and very impressive. And we're going to do a whole other episode on longevity and all the things that you have going at Amara now. But just want people to hear your story. You know, your story is sort of what this podcast was, meant to do, to let people see that honestly, that, you know, you can overcome almost anything, and that, you know, the most difficult circumstances in our lives can become the things that are our biggest blessings. And talking to you about your story, I heard that shine through. So really appreciate you being here, brother.
I'm super honored to be here, and thank you so much. Yeah, it's an interesting time in my life to be telling this story, right? And I'll explain what I mean by that as we dig in a little bit. But you know, the story starts in Houston, Texas, just south of Houston, about 30 miles, in a little blue-collar suburb called Sagemont. And I was born in 1966. I'm 59 years old. And my parents were working class, you know, blue collar. My dad was blue collar. My mom worked a multitude of jobs. And they were from the piney woods of East Texas. And they were starting life down south of Houston and bought their first, I guess what you would call a starter home these days. And it was, it's funny when you're a kid and you're growing up, like the world is just so much bigger. And when you're older and you go back to where you grew up, it just looks so much different than the way you remember it in your head. But man, there was a lot of kids on the street, and a lot of us were around the same age. But the one interesting difference was I was an only child, and that street was full of families that had, 3, 4, 5 siblings, So I didn't understand it at the time, but I felt a little different, as every night when we would be playing in the street and you had to, your mom would call for you to come inside. They had these brothers and sisters, and they were all going in, and they had, a bunch of people around the dinner table. And in my memory, they played games after dinner and stuff. And I was an only kid, so I went in, and it was just, me and my mom and my dad, and I was jealous, right? Like I wanted brothers and sisters. So you just feel a little different. And then to add to that feeling, my dad was, he was a troubled guy. He struggled with alcohol and some other things. He had demons, man. He was just one of those guys. He was the oldest, I think, of 5. He had some brothers and sisters, and again, from the country in East Texas, where life could be hard, in that sort of socioeconomic group. But he was trying to create a better life by getting out of there and into the big city. And a lot of that was my mom driving him. But he struggled, man. And he was the kind of alcoholic that, sometimes they make movies about. It could get really volatile and really uncertain and unpredictable. That was the first 12 years of my life. And how that story, sort of act 1, comes to a close is one night I was out playing in the street with my buddies, and he had moved out of our house about 2 weeks prior to this, in my memory. Could have been longer or shorter, but that's what it feels like. Into an apartment not too far by. So I looked up and I saw his truck pull in our driveway, and he wasn't supposed to be there. I was a little curious, and I could see him stumble out of the truck, and he was clearly, he'd fall down drunk. And I looked up, and that in and of itself was not really anything unusual. He was, I don't want to say known for it, but there were more than one or two episodes where he had been, sort of the town drunk, and whether it was at a little league game or driving home, when I was a kid, he'd pick me up from kindergarten and occasionally stop off at the bar on the way home, and I would color in my coloring book and stuff at the bar. And every once in a while, not every once in a while, I can remember twice that we didn't make it home, went off into a ditch, and I came home in a police car. So the idea that he was stumbling, fall down drunk wasn't necessarily shocking or new. It's just, but he wasn't supposed to be there. And I saw him go inside the house, and after 10 or 15, 20 minutes, I got that weird feeling that you get sometimes in the pit of my stomach. And I thought, I'm going to go in and just check on things. And so I get inside, and I can hear raised voices, and I can hear my mom pleading, and I go around the corner, and he's got her against the wall and choking, and I was 12 at the time, and I started, and I was a little guy, I was a little kid, and I started asking, begging for him to let her go, and he did. He walked past me, and he went into the closet in their bedroom. And now I'm standing there, 12 years old. My mom's over here to my right. He passes in front of me and goes this way. And I'm looking into the closet, and I see him, and he's rummaging around for something. And I'm like thinking to myself, what's he doing in the closet? And I feel my arm being yanked and pulled, and out of the room, down the hall and towards the front door. And just before we could make it, he catches us and grabs us and puts us out onto the front porch and takes us to the end of the porch on our knees. And he's got a 12 gauge shotgun and he's pointing at us. And my mom is between me and the house, and I'm on the edge, and there's this little porch, and neighbors are out in their yards across the street. And I want to say it's twilight, but as I'm kneeling there thinking, this is it. And he's really drunk, and he's really mean, and he's really saying all the things. And I thought, this is where things end. And I'm begging him, please don't kill us, Daddy, please don't kill us. And the neighbors start to try to negotiate from across the street, like, hey, Bill, put the gun down. You don't want to do this. And one of them wanders into the street to get a little closer to try to reason with him, I guess. And he takes the gun, and he turns, and he points the gun towards that gentleman. And in that moment, Steve, I just look over, grab my mom up, pull her off the porch, and we run between the two houses. And there's a little short chain link fence, and I shove her over that fence into the neighbor's backyard, and we run inside, and I scream, Harry's got a gun, call the police. And so the neighbors, he goes to get his gun, the wife's calling the police, we're sort of sitting at the kitchen table, and he winds up getting in his van. I think he had a van or a truck. I can never remember. Back then, was one of the two. Anyway, he gets in his vehicle and he drives off. And sometime between that moment and Monday morning, that was on a Friday, between that and Monday morning, he wound up turning that same shotgun on himself and taking his own life in his apartment. As we went over there on Monday morning, he was my Little League baseball coach. And so on Monday morning, my mom was taking me to school, and she had been trying to call him all weekend, and he wasn't answering. This is 1978, so we're way before cell phones. And we drive by there on Monday morning, and his vehicle's there, but he's not answering the door. So she takes me to school, drops me off. And later that afternoon, I had gotten in trouble at school, and I'd been sent to the principal's office. And I'm walking back from the principal's office, and it's during class, so the hallways are empty. And I look out across the cafeteria, and I see, well, first I hear shoes on the tiles, on the cafeteria floor tiles. I remember it as a big cavernous space. It was an elementary school. but you could hear the click, 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 click of the heels. And I look up and I see my mom, and I walk over and I'm like, what are you doing here? And we sit down at one of the tables, and she tells me that my dad was dead. And, that was how, what I guess I would call chapter of Act 1 of the first 12 years of my life sort of started and came to a transition point. I don't want to call it a close because it was far from closed, as we'll kind of go on and learn later, but I'll pause there and just, take a quick breath, see if you have any questions.
Yeah, I mean, well, I just want to say I'm so sorry that that happened to you. I mean, that's one of the most intense stories that I've ever heard. And yeah, I don't really have much to add to it, honestly. I mean, I appreciate you telling it in such detail. And I'm so sorry that you and your mother and your father had to go through that.
Yeah, thank you. Um, it's interesting as I'll tell sort of what happens next. The reframing of telling this story. Why I believe I've told it all these years was because it made me significant. It made me matter. Like if I tell, it made you want to hear what I have to say. I matter because of that, right? As opposed to really looking at what was the lesson in it, and
Mhm.
and that whole thing. So that's the part where I said it's an interesting time for me to be telling this again because I haven't told it in a long time. But I started thinking about it over the weekend. Like as I tell this story, it feels different. And I think it feels different because my relationship to it is different. For a long time, this became my identity. And I'm less concerned and interested now by the story of the past as much as I am my identification to it, with it, right? And so that's kind of where I'm at now. Interestingly, which I feel like is maybe what growth is supposed to feel like, or certainly healing. But so what happens next is my mom remarries, and my dad, Jim, wound up adopting me. So this was about a year later. So that was in the 7th grade when that happened, and we're coming up to the summer. And then by the 8th grade, a few months later, I started school at a different part of town. And it was a very wealthy part of town. It was a private school. It was a private Baptist school. And everything changed. And it changed dramatically for the better. But in that circumstance, after what just happened and what had been happening, and I grew up again on the sort of what I would call a more blue-collar subdivision of Houston, and now I'm in the wealthiest neighborhood of Houston. That's a good thing, right? Like things are going the right direction. And Jim was just a phenomenal human being. He was a first-class human. So all the things, right? I'm super grateful that I got a chance at what I don't want to, diminish him into Dad 2.0, but Dad 2.0 was by far, I consider him, my father. So I start the 8th grade, and again, that feeling of being different comes up. All these kids had gone to school together with something since they call Pooh Corner, which is kindergarten. They knew each other, and they wore the right clothes. They wore the right penny loafers and the khakis and the Madras shirts and the stuff, right? And I was a kid from the other side of town who came over and, just met everybody for the first time. So again, I felt different. And one of the things that I learned about myself was I became very adaptable. I could fit in really well wherever I needed to fit in. That comes at a cost. I think you wind up not really understanding who you are along the way. And again, none of this you're really aware of in the moment. I could fit in with the preppies or the jocks or the stoners or the athletes or, it's just, whatever. You just become highly adaptable. But again, things were markedly better in terms of the quality of life. Jim was not an alcoholic. He was a real estate developer, and he was doing really well. And so there was a country club and tennis lessons, and there was a condo in Beaver Creek and skiing, and there was a ranch in South Texas. And so it was idyllic, man. It was awesome. But back then we didn't really know about therapy or a lot of those things. And I can tell you that my mom is the kind of person that made sure I had whatever I needed, whether she had it or not, if that makes sense, right? Like, I didn't know this, but when I was a kid, she ironed my clothes every night before school, and she was working 3 jobs to make sure that I never went without. And so if I needed a new bicycle, I got a new bicycle. I never went without, but it came at her, and she's always been an incredibly hard worker. And so if I wanted clothes like all the other kids wore now, then I got the clothes. She was always making sure that, I had what I needed. But we didn't know about things like therapy. And there was a little bit of talking here and there and stuff, but for the most part, it was like, hey, that was bad. This is great. Let's move on. And I think that at some point kind of catches up to you. And so for me, I started experimenting. I migrated towards the kids who were smoking pot and drinking and doing things like that. And, I identified with that pretty well. I liked the way it made me feel. And at the time, again, I don't realize I don't like the way I feel. I'm trying to change it with drugs and alcohol. I just know that this feels good, right? And that gets me in some trouble. I bounce around to a couple of schools. I go to 3 schools in 3 years, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. In the 10th grade, I go to this public school and the wheels come off. I'm partying all the time. I'm making terrible grades. I got a bad attitude. I'm just, as a parent, I'm just any parent's worst nightmare. And one day the door, feels like it's coming off the hinges. It was like 5:00 in the morning. And my dad comes through, and he wasn't a big guy, but he had a presence, man. I mean, he didn't have to say much. He didn't have to pound his chest. He just had this presence. And when he was serious and he meant business, you knew it. But it wasn't a flex for him, right? Like, he was really kind and really generous in all the ways. So when he needed to be, the authoritarian, it was there. So he's like, get up and put on a suit and be downstairs in 15 minutes. And I did. I was down there in 10. And we get in the car and we drive to Hobby Airport. And he opens the trunk and he says, do you want to take this with us? And there was this briefcase where I was stashing all my weed. And he had found it. And the reaction was, this is bad. He's a drug addict. And we got to scare him into, to stopping. And I'm like, no, I don't think we want to take that on an airplane. So we got on a plane and we flew down to Harlingen, Texas, which is where this military school called Marine Military Academy is located. And it's run by, as the name implies, ex-Marine Corps drill instructors. Guys that were in Korea, guys that were at Iwo Jima, just hardened professionals who were really good at getting the attention of teenage fuck-ups like me, right? And so we fly down there, and we make this tour of the school, and they, take you off with some cadets, and they put you in a couple different rooms and talk to you about, what's good and what's right and what's wrong in the world and what your relationship is to it all. And we get on a plane and we fly back home that afternoon. And, the ground rules are pretty simple. Not more than $10 in my pocket at any given time. No, straight to school and back, no spending the night anywhere, no parties, none of that stuff. So my response to those new rules was to wait till they went to bed, raise the window and jump out the window and have a buddy come pick me up. And I went to his house and I stayed there for the way I remember it, like 2 weeks. And I think I'm, on the lam, getting away with something. And come to find out, like the night I got there, his dad called my dad, of course, and said, hey, he's over here. It's fine if he stays here for a few days, blah, 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 right? So he did what you do as a parent. But me, I think, hey, I'm rebel on the lam and I'll show them. And so it winds up with me in the summer seeing a friend of mine who had gone down to that school halfway through the sophomore year. His dad didn't wait till summer. He sent him at Christmas. And the guy went down there 35, 40 pounds overweight. He had a terrible GPA like me, terrible attitude like me, and he came back and he had lost all this weight. He had a 4.0 and he was full of yes sirs and no sirs and yes ma'ams and no ma'ams. And I was like, wow. I mean, the transformation was truly noticeable. And I wound up spending the summer with him. He was the first person I'd met in the 8th grade when I went to that private school when I first moved over there. And the influence was starting to rub off on me, and I asked him, I said, "Are you going back down there?" And he said, "It's hard to argue with results." I thought, there's a lot to be said for that. So I went to my parents and I said, "I'll go down there." It made it easier that I had a buddy that was down there. So I spent my junior and senior year in a military school that I tried to get kicked out of multiple times. It worked. It was definitely better. I don't think I would have gotten out of high school if I hadn't gone down there. And I wound up graduating with a 3.8, and I went in the same rank. I graduated the same rank I went in because, again, I tried to get kicked out a few times, drinking and sneaking out, doing stupid stuff. Go to college, flounder around in that. The addiction's still kicking hard. I'm not a good drinker, not a good partier, not from a lack of trying. Just, not good at it. Should not be in my life, ever, but certainly back then. But I don't know that. And so I wind up getting married, having kids, which, some say is like the equivalent of taking hostages, when you're still sort of unhealed and deep in whatever it is that, you need to be sort of, work through. But nothing terrible happens. Nothing terrible happens until October 7th of 2010. And I know what I'm going to say and tell you and everybody else next seems really unlikely, but on October 7th of 2010, I was driving from Austin to Dallas. My phone rang. And the first time it was Jim. And the second time it rings, it's my mom. And she's wailing and she's incomprehensible. I can't really make out what she's saying other than Jim. Jim was dead. And I'm closer to Dallas than I am to Austin, so I continue to Dallas and I drive to Love Field and I get on a Southwest flight and I'm a wreck, man. I'm a mess. He had become my best friend in the world. I was really, really grateful for him and like who he had become in my life and how he was there for me and showed up for me, and it was amazing. So I'm a mess when I get on this plane and I'm sitting. Shit. I haven't told this story in a while. Clearly got some processing left. And I'm sitting by the window and I'm trying to keep my shit together and I can't, I'll get it together for a minute and then I'll blow up and cry and erupt. And I'll never forget there was a woman sitting in the middle seat next to me and she just put her hand on my hand that was on my leg, and she just sort of just put it there. Never said a word. And her kindness and tenderness was really, it rescued me in that moment where I was really struggling. I didn't know what I was going to go walk into. I just knew that in a phone call, my world had turned upside down. And so I get there and a friend picks me up from the airport at Hobby and we drive to some storage units. There's yellow tape, police tape everywhere, and police cars. And I can see his vehicle. He had a Tahoe, black Tahoe, and I can see the doors are open, and it's just parked randomly in the middle of the driveway. It's a storage unit complex. And I start asking questions, and I find out that earlier that morning he woke up and he took my mom's car and took it to the car wash, put gas in it, went to the grocery store and stocked the pantry, brought our Diet Coke in and gave her a kiss and told her goodbye. And, I was on the way to work like every morning, and he had put these 5x7 index cards around the condo. And one would say, like, water this plant 3 times a week. And he drove across the street and he went into that storage unit and he took his own life. And I remember standing there, listening to all of this. My first thought was just how lonely he must have been and scared. That unit, in the dark by himself. And you can't get your head around it. And I was thinking, lightning struck twice, the same spot, same act, completely different set of circumstances. And I think that for much of my life, I have been trying to understand what this story has, why this happened, and what's the meaning. What am I supposed to get out of it? And looking for answers, right? That is another way to say it. And I think that what I've come to understand lately is that I'm much more interested in who I became as a result of the story and my identification to it and to all those things that happened in the past and how it's shaped me and informed me and explained me without defining me. And that's the part that I sort of entered into because I have 3 sons. And there's, a couple of cycles that I need to break. And one of them is, alcoholism from my biological father, Bill. I don't drink. I'm in active recovery, have been for a long, long time. And, there's the suicide cycle. And that one also stops with me. And so I'm not going to, pass on either of the legacies to my sons. You search for answers, and a lot of times they're really well intended, right? Like, okay, I don't want to do this. I don't want to repeat this. I think I'm more likely or to be susceptible. Or they say that if you're the child of a parent suicide, you're 3 times more likely to die by suicide. And I think the reason for that statistic is that there's a permission, that it's okay. I think that's what drives that number. But the child of 2, there's not a lot of data because it is fairly rare. And but I would think that they're greater, they're more likely. So you start thinking about those things and the answers, and I have to do this, I got to figure this out, and you start acquiring all this knowledge, right? You're reading things and going on these journeys and whatever it is that you're trying to sort out and heal. And I know for me, I wound up getting all of this knowledge and information with no understanding or in any way of trying to operationalize it and try to actually heal from it until much later in life. I carried around, 30 years worth of, well, more than that, 40 years worth of baggage in sound bites, but without any real understanding of how to operationalize some of this knowledge and this information and make sense of it all. And they say that, what is it that, life will keep teaching the same lesson over and over until you learn it, but it says it just wears different costumes because you mistake the costume for the lesson, right? Meaning it can be divorce, it can be business failure, it can be trauma, it can be grief, it can be, all kinds of things. It's just a different costume, but it's the same lesson at the end of the day. And I think the next decade for me, I was thinking about this over the weekend in anticipation of this, and I was like, I think there's 2 questions for me as I enter this next decade. And the first question is, who am I before I start explaining myself? And that came from this question in this daily practice that I do. And the question was, who would you be without the story? And I'm like, I don't understand. So who would you be without your story of your past? And that question really screwed me up because I couldn't answer it. And I don't know that I still can really well. And it's another way of saying, like, this identity that I've formed It's just a lens through which I see the world and explains these behaviors that I have, right? If I'm afraid of being hurt or abandoned, then I'm going to respond in this way. And, it runs around trying to manufacture evidence to confirm itself, right? See what she did, see what they did, see what I did. I'm gonna see I failed again. See, and I know I'm not good enough, right? All those kind of things, right? And it attaches itself to all those stories. And it's like you're living in this story that isn't happening anymore. Like it's over. And so I'm much more interested in who I become before I wind up explaining myself through those behaviors, right? And the second question is this, and this is the one that's fascinating me the most right now. What am I unable to see because I'm so convinced I see clearly already? Yeah? That one is the one that's got me like really, diving down some deep rabbit holes these days. And I love it. I love the question because it gives you somewhere to go. Another way of saying it is like, how we like, if you remember the 15 commandments of conscious leaders, there's above the line and below the line. And if you're above the line, you're open, you're curious, and you're willing to learn. And you're below the line, you're closed, you're defensive and committed to being right. And the idea is not how much time you spend above or below it, but to be aware of when you are, and then change your behaviors, basically, right? And so that's another way of saying, what am I unable to see because I'm so convinced I'm already seeing clearly? It's another way of saying, what am I right about? What am I so committed to being right about that I can't see another opportunity? Because you can hold beliefs, strong beliefs, and still say, what else am I missing? What other interpretation could there be for this, right? And I think that gives you somewhere to go versus, nope, that's wrong. I'm right. You're sort of stuck. There's sort of a dead end there. And so as I tell that story, and clearly I got really emotional, and I think back about the past, the context of me telling those stories in the past used to be because it made me feel significant. It made me feel interesting. It made me feel unique in some way. And now I'm a lot more curious about the person asking the questions, this me that I'm talking about, versus the answers on the other side of why did this happen. I don't think it's as important as who's the one asking the questions. And once you understand that, what are you going to do about it? Where are you going to go? Right? Because now you got endless possibility. So that's the story, at a macro level. And there's lots of things in between that you can fill in the gaps. But for the most part, that's kind of the capital T trauma story of Greg.
Wow, man. Well, again, that was really moving. And you obviously, you've told me this story in a different way before, where I kind of feel like you were telling it in a way that didn't generate the emotion. And here you really got into it. And I really appreciated that you did that and really felt it. And I'm really interested in your identification with the story, right? Because I think it's an interesting thing. I think a lot of people think the brain is reacting to what's happening, but really it's predicting what's happening, right? And the story that we tell about ourselves is a big part of what we see in the world, because our brain is predicting to make that right, like you talked about. And as somebody that's got a big story himself, and there's quite a nuance to it, right? I mean, it is. I mean, I'm going to call it dinner, like dinner time talk. But it's the kind of thing that you can get somebody engaged in. But there's also a story of resilience, of just like asking the question. I mean, those events are so intense. Like, how could they not create these incredibly strong neural pathways, which then your brain is predicting about all the things you said, unworthy and whatnot. But now you also have a different story, right? You've really worked through it a lot, and we'll talk about your addictions and all those things. And so I'm wondering, have you reframed the story into, well, I'm the person who those things happen to, and I'm orienting around them this way? And then is there less of a, I guess there would be an identification to that. I'm just wondering where the nuance is between how you're actually handling that story, and and how it feels like benefiting to your life rather than detracting from it. The same story, right?
Yeah, I think so. So I think of it like this. There's the story, there's what happened. There's the lesson, right? What's the meaning? And then there's the one learning.
Hmm.
And what I've focused on is the one learning. And I think that has changed my identification with that past, with those stories, because, we've heard you are not your thoughts. That story explains me, but it doesn't define me. And there's a couple of, sound bites and cliches like that I don't mean to diminish them. They're important, they're relevant, but they are just stories. The emergency is over. Those events are over. And I adapted to survive those events when they happened and after they happened. But I'm surviving something that is no longer happening if I don't look at how my identity, the perception of the way I see the world as a result of those events, the behaviors that came out of it, the outcomes those behaviors produced, and in an unhealthy way those outcomes can confirm, become evidence of the identity, right? And it just goes in this loop. So if I'm not enough, right? If I'm never enough, then I will look for opportunities to provide evidence to confirm that I'm not enough, whether it's sabotaging a relationship or a career or opportunity well, it doesn't matter, right? You're going to do it. You commit to being healthy, and then you don't go to the gym, and you're eating poorly again, and you're like, see, so you'll manufacture it. And I think that as long as, and I'm really fascinated and obsessed with this whole idea about identity. When we talk about longevity, I'll share that with you too, because I think, longevity is an identity long before it's an outcome. And I think that's so true for a lot of these different things, right? And you could say that about just about anything. So who's asking the questions? The 12-year-old boy or the 59-year-old man? The dad? The guy who needs to be the rescuer, the protector, the entrepreneur? Who's asking the questions now? And I'm much more interested in that as opposed to the story, the what happened, the lesson, because I believe the same lesson will be taught to us over and over and over and over and over again, just in different costumes. Again, divorce, business, entrepreneurship, addiction, recovery, doesn't matter. You're going to be learning the same lesson over and over again until you learn it. And a lot of times that really means, quit trying to ask the same question over and over again until you get the answer that you want or you like or that fits that day, and start asking better questions or different questions. So I think that's really where I'm at.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing when you talk about it and you're interested in like who asked the question. Is it the 12-year-old, the entrepreneur, the dad, who you are today? And in some senses there, I think you could say, well, hopefully it's the 59-year-old man with a kind of more wisdom, but there's something above all of that, right? And I think all of those are just like the identities that you had at a certain time, and maybe there's probably no difference, right? They're all trying to do the same thing. The 12-year-old boy is trying to do the exact same thing as the entrepreneur, as you are, and that there's, when I hear you talking about it, and you kind of have this third party, almost observer, that is above all of those, right? Like, how can you tap into, the ways we deceive ourselves to make ourselves feel safe? A lot of this is, and then to realize, well, we are safe anyway, right?
Right.
And so it's an incredible story. And I want to shift into some of the things that we've talked about before. And there's something that really stuck with me. There was a really powerful moment. You've been sober a long time, and you told me that your sponsor kind of saw right through you in a way that was pretty jarring, right? And so for people who are, like I want to hear that story. I think it's instructive to people.
That's funny. Yeah, this is the beautiful part about trying to grow and heal and learn as you look back on things without judgment, right? Without good or bad or right or wrong. They just are. This is when I think back about some of my conversations with my sponsor in my early days of sobriety. That's definitely a lifeboat that I'm calling on, right? Okay, look back at these without judgment. And this is one of them. Um, there were a couple of things. The first thing he said to me that really was one of the more profound, life-changing moments for me was he said, "You will lie, you will cheat, you will steal, you will do whatever you have to do to get your way and to get what you want. It's who you are, but you don't have to be." And I went, "Say that again." And he's like, "You'll do whatever it takes to get your way and to get what you want." And he was giving examples like I would sneak drinks in a Yeti at a kid's birthday party and with double Tito's in it, right? I mean, like I'm going to have this birthday party, but I'm also going to catch a buzz because I was going to get what I want, right? And he was using these examples and he's like, that's who you are. It's in your DNA. It's who you are, but you don't have to be. And I said, well, say more about that. And he goes, follow the steps, work the steps, follow the steps, stay sober. And you won't show up as that person. And it was the most liberating day in my life at that time because I went, like okay, that's there's a plan. Like there's a thing that I can do. And that's all, because I hated the way I felt. I knew that about myself. I knew that I would make these terrible decisions and these terrible choices, like drinking at my son's 7-year-old birthday party. And I don't mean a little bit. I don't mean sipping a little bit. I mean, pushing it to the edge. And I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't want to be the guy, but I did over and over again, despite my whatever I told myself and my best intentions. And so I was like, yeah, just work the steps, don't drink, follow this plan, and you won't show up as that guy anymore. And I was so relieved, right? It was amazing. So that was the first big profound insight that he had. Is that the one you were talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems like, there's an interesting thing. The way that he phrased it, or at least you phrased it, was he said they're part of your DNA, which sounds like it's not changeable, honestly. And, so it's an interesting phrasing.
Yeah, he was trying to make a point. He was trying to say, look, you get sober and you work the steps and you do all these things and you're going to stop doing those things. You're going to stop having behavior, but you're not going to stop being an alcoholic, right? You're always going to have this at your core. Alcohol just doesn't work for you when you put it in your body. That's what the point he was trying to make, right? Not like it was, genetically encoded, which that's a whole different story for a whole different conversation. But what he was trying to say was you can get sober and stay sober for long periods of time and be in active recovery for a long period of time. But at the core, underneath, this is kind of what drives your OS and you don't like it. And so you're going to try to find some external solution to that internal problem, right? To change that feeling, right? And so I think that was the point he was really trying to make. And the other thing that he said to me, I just remembered this real quick, is he said, he looked at me and he goes, where are you at with God? Now, given the stories that I just told you, it may not surprise you to learn that I was kind of angry with God. And I grew up in the church. I grew up first 12 in the Baptist church where, it was a little fire and brimstoney. And then my dad, Jim, was Episcopal. And I grew up in that church. I was an altar boy. And so I had plenty of religious influence in my life and I understood things. But at this point in my life, I was pretty angry. And he said, so where are you at with God? And I said, I don't know. And he goes, that's okay. You don't have to know. You just have to know it's not you. And that was enough for me to go, okay, I can get with that. Right? Like, quit playing God because you're not it. Right? Just, and you don't really have to know where you're at and have your relationship with God or the universe or Buddha or higher power. It doesn't matter, whatever it is. You don't have to source. You don't have to have it solved or resolved right now. Just, it's not you. And it cracked the door open enough for me to get curious about spirituality. And so they're just, he said the right things at the right moments when I needed to hear them. That really kind of shook me out of my, being stuck.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because when I hear that, I would say that I've heard so many positive stories about how AA has affected people's lives positively. It's kind of hard to deny. And there's also some part of me that's always rebelled against that notion and what I heard of this powerlessness, right? And so, like, when I hear you, like, you haven't drank for how long?
10 years.
10 years. So you haven't had a drink for 10 years, yet you say, and I say, well, that's not the behavior of an alcoholic. An alcoholic drinks, that's the way I would define it, right? And so, it's an interesting thing because, for me, I haven't drank for 4 years. And I don't, I wouldn't consider myself in recovery just because I've gotten to a point where it's like, that just doesn't serve, listen, it's not interesting at all to me. I'm using no willpower not to drink. I don't do all kinds of things, right? I don't, there's a lot of behaviors that I don't engage in because they're bad for me or I'm not interested in them. And for me, I felt like it was more of a journey of really realizing that the alcohol was soothing my traumatic sensations that I was trying to
Yeah.
avoid. And if I really just focused on that, so instead of orienting around like I'm a drug addict or I'm an alcoholic or whatever, I was like, I'm orienting around, I'm going to be the kind of person who puts, kind of regulating my nervous system or, having some mastery of it, or at least understanding of it enough to be like, oh, like I'm triggered right now. Like, what do I normally go to? It's alcohol or whatever. Now I'm going to breath work or cold plunge or whatever. But I've always rebelled against that notion that I was an alcoholic. And so, and I guess I wonder what your take is on all that and what you.
I think to your point, AA has gotten and kept a lot of people sober, and it worked for me, and I totally get it, right? Like saying, okay, hi, I'm Greg, I'm an alcoholic, and the reason in AA that we do that is just to kind of remind yourself that, look, you can go 10 years without drinking alcohol. Does it mean that you're cured and you're no longer an alcoholic? That's I don't think it does. I don't like to talk in cures anyway. I think what the reminder is if I put alcohol in my body, there's a really high likelihood that it's not going to have a great outcome, right? Like they're not going to end well for Greg, right? I'm going to start making poor choices and impact the people around me and have a lot of collateral damage. So I think that's part of it. But I also love what you said too about the identity as I'm a person who doesn't do a lot of these bad behaviors anymore because I want to do things that are better for me and they're going to benefit me in other ways. That's an identity, right? And I think and I love that because I'm trying to stop drinking. That's not an identity. I no longer do things that are detrimental to where I'm going and who I'm trying to become any longer. That's an identity. Like I'm an athlete, right? What do athletes do? They train. Athletes aren't, well, I'm trying to get in shape or I'm trying to lose weight. You're giving a lot of power away in that, right? With opposed to when there's a true identity shift and this is who I am, I think it has long-term impact in terms of driving behaviors that you're seeking, right? And that are more optimal to where you are and where we're trying to go in life.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I've researched the identity thing quite a lot, and it's definitely true. And I think this is kind of some of the thing. Like, so when I hear I'm an alcoholic, to me, it's like, okay, that you're creating an identity there. Whereas if it was like, I'm the person who puts my family first. I'm the person who values health. I'm the person who thinks that masculinity is taking care of my business here so it doesn't leak out into all my people. And that means that I don't drink.
I mean, I think both of those can be true.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and so I guess it's an interesting sort of dynamic. And, the identity thing, there's so much research on it. One of the things that they've researched really well is when you are doing something difficult that aligns with your identity, you're more likely, your brain is more likely to see it as you being on the right path. And
Yeah,
if you are doing something difficult that does not align with your identity, you are just more likely to quit it because it's an indicator that you've gone the wrong way and you don't have any. And so they've done all kinds of studies about people just reframing their lens of identity and trying to do the exact same thing. And then they're able to do it in a more, they're able to push through more difficult things. So it's a really interesting sort of notion. And I think, honestly, it's like whatever works, man. Like you don't need to fight over like, what's working for somebody. And, and I would say, like, look, if you're somebody like me and you get into the AA thing and it just doesn't feel right to you, there's all kinds of other ways to go.
100%.
Just figure out your path and figure out like a way to move in the direction that you want to. You don't need to shit on anyone else's path,
100%.
but it's definitely, it's an interesting thing because, we both have a mutual friend of Monty Carson, and he said that he thought he would rather be dead than not drink, just because his identity was so wrapped around it. And I understood that, like, how am I going to have any fun? How am I gonna, like it was so like, I mean, I started the first time I was blackout drunk, I was 5, So
It's
like
crazy.
I didn't start drinking, daily after that, but by the time I was in 6th grade, I was. And it took a long time, but now it's funny now when I see the people who are drinking, and especially if they start to do the slurring or the what, I was like, that doesn't look I mean, I don't wanna be around that.
Yeah.
And we have parties here now, and I'll still provide some alcohol, and nobody drinks it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah,
It
there's
sits
definitely a
in my f
trend in the next generation. This current generation is drinking less. Yeah. There's subsets of the population that are actually drinking more, which is kind of an interesting. But yeah, look, I'm with you. Like, I don't need to, shit on anybody else's path or method or whatever. What works for me works for me. And what, I just, people come to me and say, I might have a problem with drinking. I mean, there's a couple of quick tells, like, can you go have two and have two? Tell yourself I'm going to have two and have two sometimes, so you don't know who's going to show up to drink. Oh yeah, that's a good way to put it. Right? Like, I mean, so then that was me. That was the way I drank. I could be on a trip and, at a hotel and on a business trip and be like, I'm going to go down to the bar and have, a couple of drinks, and then we'll call it night. And every once in a while I'd have two drinks and go back to my room. But then there were the times that regardless of what was on the agenda for the next day, I was closing the bar down with, three of my new buddies that I just met, and I never knew who was going to show up to drink, right? That was the unpredictable part. That's that powerlessness they're talking about sometimes, where it's like the guy, and I that's how I drank, right? But look, I think for me, growth is more about being truthful than committed to being right. I don't really give a shit how someone, gets there, as long as they get there if they need it, right? But it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I love that. I don't know who's gonna show up to drink because I think that's a perfect description of a lot of I mean, that's how I was. I oftentimes could have a couple drinks. I mean, probably more often than not. I just didn't know when it was going to 12, you
Right.
know?
Right.
And then it was once the switch was flipped, it was on. And the other part that I think was interesting, you said, your sponsor said, the relationship with God, and as long as it's not you. And I think that ties back to what you were saying about what am I not seeing here, right? If you have enough humility to understand that I might not see as clearly as I think I do, and I think all of us, there's no way you really can see clearly. Like with the way the brain works, it doesn't work like that. You can be open to seeing more things. And so I think that's a really great notion for somebody to just be like, and I've never really thought about it this way, but just the concept of God in your life says, I don't see everything clearly, in a way that might be helpful to be more open and more curious, like you talked about.
Yeah, that prison of certainty, right, is one of the prisons. I have this. I didn't write this. I heard it from somewhere, and I don't remember where, but it said, "You can't escape a prison you don't know you're in." Right, and what that means is if you're not aware of your behavior, you can't fix it. Right, you can't escape a jail cell that you've put yourself in that you don't know you put yourself in. And so the first thing to do is have that awareness. And so I call that one that prison of certainty where I'll tell a story and see if it'll make some sense. I think I can capture this. But a long time ago, I was in my 20s and I was seeking knowledge and I went to this thing called the Landmark Forum. And it was really cool. There was a lot of good technology and concepts around the Landmark. And in the very beginning, the very first weekend that I went, the guy on stage, his name was Jerome, I remember, and he said, "I'm gonna do an exercise. Can I get a volunteer?" And I raised my hand, and he chose me, and so I went up, and he's holding this pencil, this number 2 pencil, between his fingers, and he goes, "How many pencils am I holding up?" And I said, "1." He goes, "Can you see 2 pencils here?" I just thought for a minute, and I mean, there's 400 people standing behind me, right, boring a hole in my head, and I'm like, "God, I need the right answer here, right? I don't want to look like an idiot." And I'm like, "No." And he goes, "Then try to see 2 pencils here." And I can't do it. And I'm like, "You're holding 1 pencil." He goes, "Just keep trying. Try to see 2 pencils." So I reach up, I grab the pencil out of his hand, I snap it in two, and I hand the pieces back to him. And I go, "Okay, now there's 2 pencils." And he got a chuckle from the room. And I thought, ah, ha, ha, I'm clever. And you remember I'm in my 20s, so I'm still in, the asshole phase. And at the time, I'm thinking, oh, okay, I showed him, I won that exchange. And, now, decades later, I realize I just proved his point entirely, right? When I broke the pencil, it wasn't that I didn't break the pencil because I understood the exercise. I broke it because I couldn't tolerate not understanding it. Right. Just as there is a pencil there, there's also not a pencil there. Right. Like there's 2 pencils. But I mean, it wasn't about that. It was about we have these frameworks of certainty and these perceptions of reality that are just unbreakable. And I destroyed the object of that reality so that it would meet my perception. And that was the whole point of the exercise. And I'm like, think about how many things in our lives we do that with. And we're so certain this is the way it is. And God forbid we need a villain in that story, right? Your parents or an ex or somebody, an ex's ex. I mean, we're going to find a villain. And at the end of the day, when you get back into it, you can't escape a prison you don't know you're in. And that's where that awareness comes in. And it comes around alcohol. It comes around relationships. It comes in business. Comes in all forms and all costumes. And the lesson is the same. Am I willing to see? What am I unable to see? Because I'm so convinced that I'm already seeing clearly. If you're stuck in whatever I see is the way things are in that prison of certainty, man, there's a lot of tough lessons in there. I've learned a lot of them, a lot, right? And I'm tired of learning the same fucking lesson over and over, right? I'm ready to move on to a new set of lessons. So yeah, that's what that is for me.
Well, it's interesting because that reminds me of another thing that you told me about, and I think they link really well. Tell us the story about you being in the 2 chairs.
Oh my gosh. That was another big moment inside 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And I'm on this journey, right? I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to operationalize this knowledge and this information that I'm out here collecting. And I was working with Natalie. She's a somatic therapist, a somatic coach. And it's like a Tuesday. And again, I'm a grown man, right? Like I'm at this point, I'm probably 57, 56. And I'm sitting in this bar stool at this apartment, this corporate apartment in Houston. And I'm on a Zoom call with Natalie, and it's like 10 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. And I'm pretty anxious. I'm frustrated. I don't know that I necessarily want to be there. And she's a somatic therapist. So she picks up on all the things, all the body language, all the signs, the clenched jaw, the raised shoulders, all the things, the chest and tension. And we start talking and she's like, what's going on? I'm like, nothing. It's all good. Nothing's going on. All right. And she says, okay. And so we start talking a little bit and I immediately go in and on myself. And, and she is like, okay, do you have another chair next to you? And I said, yes. And she goes, I want you to sit in it. So I moved chairs and she goes, okay, now in the one you just got out of, I want you to put your youngest son. What's his name? I said, Lawson. She goes, okay, put Lawson in that chair. And in your chair, your adult regulated Greg. I'm like, okay. And she goes, now I want you to talk to Lawson like you talk to yourself. Tell him how he's never going to make it. They're never going to pick him. He's never going to be enough. The girl won't love him. He won't get the job. He won't be successful. Tell him like you talk to you. And I burst into tears and I was like, no, I was like, no, I can't imagine talking to my son that way. Right. And no parent could. And I looked up at her and tears were streaming down my face. And, I'm like, I get it. I get it. I understand the point of this lesson. I got this lesson. And started to take that to an extreme where even when you say things like, oh gosh, I'm so dumb. Like, stop. Right. And it sounds a little silly, right? To be like, we don't talk about ourselves that way. But when you're really trying to reprogram 50 something years of patterns and behaviors and thought processes and identity and everything else, you almost do need to be hyper vigilant about it, right? And just be like, hey, okay, let's not say I'm stupid. Let's not say, those kinds of things and talk about ourselves in that way. And so I would catch myself doing it and be like, and they say the body doesn't know the difference, that you're joking or you don't really mean it. It just still registers it that way. But yeah, that was a big moment for me because you start to realize how you do talk to yourself and how you, even if it's not out loud, your thoughts, right? Like, oh, it's not going to happen for me. It's not, they wouldn't pick me or I'm not going to. Yeah. So that was super powerful. It was a really important Tuesday for me.
It's really interesting to hear it. I mean, I love that story. There's a couple of reasons. I mean, honestly, when you tell it, I started to get, weepy. I'm kind of a weeper or whatever. It's my
Awesome. I
brand is
love
weep
crying.
on the fucking internet. But, to hear it. But the other thing that arose, and this is the second time you've told me that story, and what came this time also was like not only like how sad it is to kind of hear those things that you're telling yourself, but how wrong they are. Like I think when you're talking about saying it to your kid, it's not only that you wouldn't say it because you're not going to be mean to him, but you wouldn't say it because it's wrong. Even no matter what, even if his life up to this point would say probably the next decision he makes is not a good one, you wouldn't say every future decision is going to be poor. You'd be like, no, I mean, we've seen hundreds of examples of people shifting it up. So it's a combination of, I think that the way the nervous system works, especially people who've had a lot of trauma, like the triggered parts of our brain that run things, in reflecting in trauma, they are much more willing to just stay in known misery than they are to unknown joy. Because it's the survival instincts. It doesn't matter whether you're happy or healthy or thriving or any of that. You're alive. So I'm sticking in this thing, and the other parts of your brain go online. And so when you're talking about yourself, right, it's only the amygdala, those sort of parts of your brain. But when you shift to your son, all of a sudden your prefrontal cortex comes online. Like, no, I'm not going to like say these things that are horrible, and they're just not true.
Yeah, it was unkind, right? They're also really unkind, and you wouldn't, they're not. It's wrong. It's not true. They're unkind, but yet we will treat ourselves. And I'll tell you, Steve, what you're just saying made me think of something too. It's a big moment because it starts to change and reframe your relationship to yourself, right? And how you treat yourself. And I think for me as a dad, I'm gonna stay there as a parent, as a dad with 3 sons. I think about how much of that undealt with or the lack of awareness of those kinds of things informs how I parent, informs how I react to them as they're young and they're little. And I'll give you an example. Because I think, it's like when you're getting sober, in your recovery, it's like you take care of you so that you can show up as a better father, husband, or partner, coworker and things. There's a lot of truth in there, right? Like if you don't take care of you first, then you're probably not going to show up your best. And I think that there's another lesson. There's another story that I'll share with you that illustrates this for me, in that how we talk to ourselves. Probably 6-7 years ago, I asked a question, and I said to my ex, "Do you think the boys know who I really am?" And without blinking, she said, "I don't think anyone knows who you really are." And she wasn't trying to hurt my feelings, but it did. And again, not on purpose, because you want to be knowable, right? And certainly to your children. And it sort of stuck with me. And a few days later, I was meeting with my sponsor, and he was asking me about forgiveness. And he said, "Where are you at with forgiveness with Bill, my biological father that held us at gunpoint?" Now, you remember that was when I was 12, and I'm 52 or 3 at this point. I'm like, well, that was a long time ago. And I understand forgiveness is for me, not for him. And, he's dead, so I got to do the work. It's not like you're going to go make an amends or he's going to make an amends or something. And I thought I was kind of off the hook. And I said, but here's something interesting. I have not been back to that cemetery since I was 12 years old. And he goes, "Maybe there's something to look at there." Well, maybe. So I leave. The next morning I wake up. It's on my mind. And I don't want to go. It's like a Wednesday. And it's 45 minutes from my house. And I got things to do. And it might rain. It might not, but it might. And so I was coming up with all these reasons that I shouldn't go, which was telling me that's exactly what you should be doing. You need to go. I'd learned to love enough through recovery to know if there's something really you don't want to do, you should be doing it. Or, you should consider looking at why maybe. And so I got in my car and I drove down there. 3 times I pulled off the road and was going to turn around. Once, because it actually did start raining. I can't go there in the rain. And 2, it was Wednesday and I had things to do, and, I'm a grown man or some damn thing. Anyway, so I get all the way down there. I finally get there and I go into the building because I don't remember where the gravesite is. And there's a woman behind the counter, and she's in her 60s and very Texas, very, very pretty, and her hair's all done up and, her makeup and all this stuff. And she goes, "Honey, can I help you?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." I said, "I need help finding a gravesite." And she said, "Are you a friend of the family?" And I said, "No, ma'am." I said, "It's my dad's." And she goes, "Well, honey, how long has it been since you've been here?" And I said, "Well, you're going to make me do some math, but it's been like 41 or 2 years." And without blinking, without hesitating, she looks at me and she had this warm, soft smile. And she goes, "Time does get away from us, doesn't it?" And I started laughing. And I was like, it was like at the same time, simultaneously, the kindest thing she could have possibly. She was letting me off the hook for 41 years and not come. And at the same time, it was also like the most Texas thing she could have possibly said. It was just kind and warm. And I just started laughing, and she kind of laughed as well. And this kid came out, and I call him a kid. He's probably 30. And he said, "Hey, you want to follow me?" And I said, "Sure." So I followed him out, and he showed me where the gravesite was. And quick sidebar, it was really kind of funny. He's about halfway back to his little minivan, and he turns around and he pulls a card out of his pocket, and he goes, "Hey, if you ever need to make plans for yourself or a loved one," and he's hustling me right there at the gravesite, right, with his business card. And I started laughing. He didn't know what to do with it. He had no idea. He's like, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to offend you." And I'm like, "On the contrary, my friend." I'm like, "I respect the hustle. One sales guy to another. That's got to be really hard to do." He's just like, he has no idea what to do with this, right? He's like, "Did I offend this guy? What's he doing?" He's laughing. He's telling me he respects me. So I was like, "Give me your card in case I ever need it," So I'm like, "Here's mine." That was kind of funny. And he leaves me there to say a few words and to do what I'm going to do. And And I do. I shed some tears. I forgive my father, and I say that I am a good dad, that I am, a good provider, and it it felt hard to say these things and to come through these tears while I was saying them. And I get in my car and I'm driving back, and I start to realize the question I asked a few days ago was, "Do you think the boys know me?" I said, "I don't think anybody really knows you." And I think that was a safe question because I knew that. I already knew that. And I had been that way my whole life. Remember, I told you I felt different. So I had a mask on my whole life, right? What is it? Persona's the costume ego wears, I mean, it's like I've been performing my whole life. So I knew the answer to that question. But I think the question I was really wanting to ask, but was terrified about the answer, was, am I doing a good job? Am I good at this? Right? That's a different question. And I think that when you are stuck in that prison of certainty about the way that you see the world, and this identity that has shaped your behaviors, and the lens through which you now perceive the world, and you don't ever say, what am I not seeing? Because I'm so convinced I already see so clearly. I think it cost those 3 little boys. I think I stayed stuck 41 years, man. It took me to go back to that fucking cemetery. I mean, so that's a bunch of unprocessed stuff informing the way that I parent, the way that I behave, the way that I move through the world as a coworker, as a partner, as a parent. And I think that that's the real cost. That's a real hidden cost. And so when people talk about, not just moving on and doing all these other things, I'm like, man, I thought I had moved on too, until you start to really dig in and you have those Tuesday morning with Natalie, where all of a sudden you see, holy shit, right? Like, this is how I thought about myself. I didn't even think I was doing a good job, or at least I was afraid to ask and find out, and you couldn't give yourself that as a parent. I mean, that's huge, right? It's big. It's going to show up in that relationship in a lot of ways. And so that's also, one of those big lessons for me when I look back and I'm stuck in a prison that I didn't even know I had built. And so you can't escape it when you don't even know you're in it. So it's the awareness. Just be willing to see some things that you may not have seen before.
Yeah, it's interesting. We spoke about this. I grew up near where you live, and I haven't been to my dad's gravesite either.
Yeah.
I intended to get out there and kind of see it because I know there is a lot that's unsaid. There's a lot of sadness there. And it's interesting because I'm coming into this time it's been really challenging for me with my son and daughter recently. I think as my nervous system has calmed down enough where they're able to really surface what's been going on for them. And I've oriented, like I oriented around being a good dad because, I had a dad, like I played catch with him one time. I mean, he was there was no suicide, like he was there, but he was an alcoholic and, didn't have the kind of treatments that we have, and I lived in a violent house, and just really at the end of the day there just wasn't much like attention or care. And I've coached the football teams and taught them how to ski and surf and all these things, and in my mind I was like, man, I mean, I have given them so much more than my dad. Like, I'm a good dad. And, we had some conversations recently that are coming up, and, they both express some things, about how they feel like I put the women in my life ahead of them, and, and that I didn't seem as, caring about their feelings as they would have liked. And it was interesting. I mean, I was able to hear it, and like, not, and withdrew a little bit, but not too defensive or whatever. And it was, I mean, this just happened last week. The next day I was just in a shell, right? I mean, I knew like this was like, I was very contracted. I lost a whole day of work. I just kind of like basically ended up, watching TV. And, finally my son came down and I was like, you want to watch this movie with me? And it was this father-son movie. And I just like burst into tears with him, and I was like, "I'm so sorry. Yeah, I'm so sorry for the way that you felt." And it's interesting. I mean, as far as moving the lineage down the road, like I've definitely done a better job than that. And I think that, I mean, he was very consoling of me, and he's like, "You're not a bad dad, like, and we had a really nice moment and all that." But I really just like immediately went from not like did a lot of good things, but didn't handle everything perfectly, and like the normal stuff to like you're just shit, and it was interesting. I was talking with someone pre-interviewing them, and he was like, and he has kids and older kids, and he's like, the tendency that I see is as adults we end up kind of filling our children's trauma buckets up with our stuff because we can't handle it, it's overflowing. And then as we're able to empty our buckets, it's their turn to pour theirs into our bucket because we can handle it and help them now. And so that really made me feel a lot better about it because I was like, oh, okay, that I was able to let them go on. This is 2 hours of talk back and forth. And, it was just very difficult for me. And, intellectually, I don't feel like a bad dad. And I'm in it with them and all of it. But it's really interesting to see how these things just play out over time. And I really do think it's interesting to think about it in the terms of a lineage. It also connects me to my father more, right? Because instead of like rejecting everything about him, I was like, well, I've tried to turn that into, I've oriented around being a good dad and I've pushed the ball forward. And I think Apollo and Athena will push the ball forward on our lineage, and less about rejecting everything about it and more about just being like, we're part of this kind of same team, and you handed me the ball at whatever yard line, I'm moving it forward. um, you know and so yeah, it's an interesting thing to just be this age. I'm a couple years younger than you. I'm 57, and to still be working through all this stuff, and to really see honestly like the level of maturity and facility and emotional awareness that my kids have at 18 and 20, that like I didn't have until or maybe I still don't have it. But that took me many decades later. And there's something to be said for the parenting to kind of allow that to emerge. But my experience with this process is like, I think, and I still deep down inside want it to be that I've gotten somewhere and everything is easy. But really, it's really just a path. And really what I find is when I get to a place that I'm more resilient, then there's more hard things come up that I'm able to handle and kind of move through, but they're not easy. Even this thing, starting a new career that's like uncertain monetarily and sort of attacking my provider thing, right? I mean, I always had that down. And honestly, like, I don't know how this podcast makes money, and so it's like, okay, like I'm getting these things, and it's like, oh, okay, like, am I, like, can I, like, what kind of person am I without this image of the provider, right? And like, what worth do I even have if that's not at least underlying it all, right? And I know for a lot of guys, I mean, you made a bunch of money and did a lot of things in business, and we talked to these people, and it's an empty suit, right? It's like it doesn't bring the peace that you think it would. I mean, there's some level of satisfaction, right? Like the world is hard. You go out there and you make something happen. I mean, there's, like, yes, it's good, but it doesn't do the things in this kind of work and just having these conversations, right? Like I'm interested in, you kind of told me, in some of the times we were talking about the story, right? You'd sit on a bar stool and you were going to get that same story, 15 years ago. If you're at the bar, you're getting that same story, right? And I'm interested now, like, when you feel like you connect with men, like, what are the ingredients there
Yeah.
that make it not that sitting on a bar stool telling this story to get the same response that you know you're gonna get, and we've all done it, right? Like, so what are the ingredients now? I know you work with a lot of men, you're a leader, you do a lot of different things. I'm interested in how that's changed for you.
Oh, that's a great question. The quick answer is the guys who leave the masks and the bullshit at home and come to have real conversations. Those are the guys that I tend to connect with. And I'll give you an example. I was at dinner the other night with a friend of mine, Jesse. And every time I go to lunch or dinner with this guy, man, it just turns into this awesome 2.5 hour experience. And so and here's an example. So I sit down, I'm already there. Jesse comes in, he sits at the table, and I'm like, yeah. And I can see on his face and in his energy, like he's primed, right? Like he's ready to go and drop in. And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, yeah. And I go, let's hear it. And he goes, I am so fucking profoundly confused in life right this second. And I love it. I've never been more excited. And I'm like, that's a hell of a way to open a conversation. Say more about that. And he goes, I'm terrified. I'm uncomfortable. I'm confused. There's all this shit. He's selling his business and he's got, he's navigating all these things in his life. And he goes, but it's all unfamiliar. And I know that's where the growth is. Whatever's on the other side of this is going to be amazing. It's going to be incredible. And he goes, I have to go through this to get to there. And that's why it's so exciting. And I was like, all right, yeah. Okay, here we go. And we just drop into 2 hours of, everything from, book recommendations to, and those are the conversations. So connecting with men who are, have that awareness, who are seeking, who are a lot more interested in truth than rightness, and in curiosity than rightness, those are the guys that I'm drawn to, that I'm interested in connecting with and talking to. And, I was talking to somebody the other day and we were telling a story about, oh gosh, man, that was like 20 something years ago. And I was getting asked all these questions and I was firing answers. And there was this friend of mine in the room. It was probably had 30 years on me and he was kind of a mentor to me. And we got out of the room and he looks at me and he goes, you don't have to have all the answers, right? I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, it's okay to sometimes not know. Well, 30-year-old Greg had to have answers, right? I mean, are you kidding me? I was going to know everything. The guys I like to connect with are the guys who don't have to know everything. We're open and curious and can sit down. And, I had a guy that uber successful, had a huge exit. And he was talking about how he felt like a fraud and imposter up until the very day. And I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, well, I'll give you an example. I would be at a peer-to-peer networking event or something. And people would say, so what do you do? I'd say, oh, I own this kind of wholesale business. And we did about $250 million last year. He goes, and I had to slip in the number because I didn't feel like the business was significant enough, or you weren't going to think that I was, important enough or something. And he goes, and I just slip in the number, the revenue number. He goes, and I hated myself the minute it came out of my mouth. Right. And this guy is a dude that I really like and I look up to and I love spending time with. We go on hikes and have these kinds of talks and do all these kind of cool things. And I'm like, this is why I like hanging around with people like this, because this guy's uber successful in my view, in my opinion. And he's, telling me that he felt like the biggest fraud and asshole when he would be at these things and tell people, oh, I'm the CEO of this. And we did about 250 million last year. I was like, the vulnerability that comes with that, right? The awareness that comes with it first, right? And it's what you were just telling me, the story you told about your children coming to you and saying things that were hard to hear, right? But they felt safe enough to do it. And, you talked about contracting and recoiling a little bit, but then, and it being hard. Yeah, I the same thing happened about 6 months ago with my sons. I had to go sit and make an amends for something that I did that I'm terrified, man, terrified to do it. I didn't know how they would respond, and the grace at which they came back, and the things that I had to hear and listen to about what I had done, I didn't want to hear, but I was so grateful that we had that kind of space that we could go in and do that and have those hard conversations and then come out of it with even more love and understanding and alignment and whatever else you want to say before. So those are the relationships that I'm looking for, man. You know, I had a friend who was going through a really tough time. Business was failing. Ex was suing him for custody of the kids. Current girlfriend was, ripping him in the industry and around reputation. Lawsuits coming from all sides. I mean, shit was rolling downhill on top of this guy from every side. And he calls me one day, and I've known him for about 25 years. And I go, "How you doing?" He goes, "Oh man, I'm great. I'm doing good, man. I'm working out, getting fit. Started get back in the gym again." And I'm like, "All right, I gotta go." And he's like, "What's the matter?" And I said, "I'm not here for that, man. I ask you how you're doing, and you tell me you're great. And you're in the gym, you're working out." I said, "You can't be great. You can't be. Your life is a complete and utter fucking train wreck right now, man. If you call me up and say I'm struggling, like making it to the gym is like a big achievement on my day because there's so much stuff and I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm here for that. I am here for that conversation all day, every day. But you call me up to tell me how great your life is and just like none of this other shit is really happening to you. I'm not interested. I'm not interested in this. Will be 15, 20, 30 minutes of my life I'll never get back and just a bunch of hot air and bullshit. So I'm not interested in those kinds of conversations and connections.
You had a good line when we talked. It was something like the cover charge to get into the event or whatever is authenticity. Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, like table stakes, yeah. Just
Yeah,
being a
yeah,
decent
yeah.
human. Um,
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's an interesting thing. It shifts. The other thing that's so nice about this way of talking and being open and a little more vulnerable is how quickly you can make connections. Because, when you have that kind of relationship, you can have it for 25 years. And, somebody that you're willing to talk like on this level, you can meet them 3 times and know more, like have more of a real connection than you do with someone you've known a long time. And it just becomes, like you said, I think uninteresting
yeah.
to like hear the story. And we've gone a long time and I really appreciate for how vulnerable you've been and the stories you told. And I want to just shift gears because there was something we talked about that I thought was just so cool and such an amazing thing. Can you tell us about Bikers Against Child Abuse
Oh, yeah.
and what that is?
Yeah. It's been a minute. I'm no longer active, and it's called Baca. And out of respect, I want to, in honor for the traditions and how Baca does not like to call attention to itself, right? The work that it does. So I think I can do it and do it honorably. Yeah, BACA stands for Bikers Against Child Abuse. And it's an organization that's existed now for 25 plus years. And it was started by a child play psychologist in Salt Lake City who noticed that these children who had suffered abuse, extreme, right? Like the hard things you don't want to hear, nobody wants to hear. They wouldn't testify. And so these perpetrators were going free. And a lot of times it was a family member or Uncle Joe, who wasn't really the uncle, but that kind of friend of the family. And it divided these families, and there was lots of conflict and tension and pressure on all sides. And so they would wind up going free because it never got far enough along, through the legal process. And so he rode motorcycles, he had a Harley as a hobby, as a passion. And he was working with these kids, and he noticed this trend, and they were terrified to go get on court. We're talking really young kids, right? 8-year-olds, 6-year-olds, who've been abused in every way that you can imagine. And he thought, well, what if I went with them and said, okay, I'll be there, I'll support you. and I'll bring some friends of mine. And so he got other friends who like to ride bikes, and the family was like, oh, that'd be great, right? And so they rode up and then escorted him at the courthouse and into the courtroom and sat in the front row, and the child felt empowered and emboldened and testified, and the perpetrator went away. And so 25 years later, BACA exists in countries all over the world, and it's just men and women who want to help children, man, and not feel afraid of the world in which they live. That's the entire mission at BACA. That's the only reason it exists, to empower children not to feel afraid of the world in which they live. And you do this by working with the courts and local law enforcement. The families can choose BACA as a support system. And we wind up, you'll adopt those children and bring them into your little BACA chapter, and they get a little road, a cut, a vest. We call them cuts in the motorcycle world. And they get a little road name and some other things. And there's a really cool event that typically happens at like a church or, a high school or something. And again, this whole thing is really coordinated through the court system and the district attorney's office. Everybody's aware of it. And the parents, of course. And we tell the child, hey, I'm going to introduce you to some friends of mine, right? On Saturday at 11 o'clock, I'm going to bring a few friends to meet you. Is that okay? And they're like, yeah, sure. And then you'll get to see the motorcycles. Okay, cool. Well, what happens is 40, 50, 60 Harleys come riding up, right? And it's this big, overwhelming, like awesome display of like, whoa, you said you were bringing a couple friends, and like there's all these people, right? And that adoption, sort of happens there. Well, not sort of, it does. And it's a big moment for these kids who are navigating some really tough things in life. And that's one of my favorite things about BACA. And then we also go to court. So one of the tactics of the legal system on the defense side is they subpoena all the family members of the child who's going to testify. And if you've been subpoenaed, you can't be in the courtroom when the child testifies. So it's a way of isolating them and making them be by themselves. And again, I'm talking sometimes these are preteen, they're young children. Sometimes it's teenage, but sometimes, a lot of times it's 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds. And so they're on the stand and they don't know anyone in the room except the district attorney who they just met. And, maybe, like that, that's it. And the perpetrator's there at the defense table with the defense attorney. And they're going to be getting cross-examined and stuff. Well, family members can't be in there, but BACA members can. So we show up and occupy the first 5 rows of the courtroom. And that child looks out across that room, and there's 5 rows of his BACA brothers and sisters who are there to support him while they testify. It's awesome. It's an awesome organization with awesome men and women who pay their own ways to drive. I've ridden from Houston to Las Vegas. I've ridden to El Paso, Amarillo, Albuquerque. I've ridden all over supporting these children and other chapters in their adoptions on my motorcycle to help support these kids. And I think it was near and dear to me because obviously, kids who have been abused is something that's close to me. I think we can all agree we can be shitty as we want to each other. We shouldn't be, but you can be, but leave the kids out of it. And so I was a member of BACA for a number of years and rode with those guys. And it's a really, really cool thing to see because the statistics are amazing too. And I'll butcher them, so I won't even try them. But the cycle repeats a lot if it's not interrupted. And so breaking those chains, the cycles, is another big part of the BACA mission. Because if a child who has been abused, we don't break those cycles, the repetition, and it's an alarming number at the number of people that are potentially victims of abuse downstream of these events. So you definitely, whether you put the perpetrator we have to, like the average perpetrator, I want to say will abuse the number 64 is in my head. It could be wrong, so I don't want to be held to that, but it's a big number, 64 people in their lifetime, right? So yeah, I was really proud to be affiliated with those guys. And man, these men and women, they don't want recognition. They don't want anything other than just, help these kids, not to feel afraid of the world in which they live. That's it. It's the whole mission.
Oh yeah, what a beautiful organization, as a kid who went through that and buried it for most of my life. And with what I know about the brain and the way you work through traumas, being able to talk about it, the courage that it takes for a little kid to speak up against that Uncle Joe or whoever it is incredible. And then to have the legal system sort of isolate them. Can you imagine being a 6-year-old and the only person in court is the person that abused you and everyone else has been subpoenaed? I mean, when you told me that story, I just thought, like, wow, that is so incredibly moving. And it's just, you hear so many things about the horrible things that are happening in the world. It's nice to know that there are organizations like this, people taking their time. You can just see how impactful it would be. I mean, it's really well known that, a kid that has a lot of trauma, if there's just one safe person in their life, the likelihood of them kind of getting through it is incredibly increased.
Yeah.
And for them to see 40 people show up for them who they don't know, that's
It's a big deal.
something that can change a life. And it's interesting because I was looking, you can't get in. I got to learn how to ride a Harley to be able to join.
It doesn't have to be a Harley, but it certainly helps if it
Yeah,
is.
but some sort of, I mean, it's literally like you have to be able to ride a motorcycle at like the highest speed limit or something, which I think I'm probably past learning. So I'll support in my
It's
heart.
Yeah, no, it's riding a bike is definitely one of the requirements. If you do it, you love to ride, and you get to ride for a cause and a purpose, and you get to ride with a bunch of really amazing human beings who, again, these just working men and women who, they just want to help kids, and they just spend a lot of their time. I put 28,000 miles on my motorcycle in 1 year. Um, that's a lot
Wow.
of anybody who rides will nod their head. That's a lot of miles on a motorcycle in a year. And it was just supporting the kids. And, that was during the pandemic because while the courts shut down and the cases weren't being heard, the abuse didn't stop. Right. So the local offices were still being inundated with these cases, but there were just nowhere for them to go. And there was all this pent up stuff. So we stayed right through it, because the kids were still being abused, even though, the legal system was on hold. So now more than ever, right? Like we were needed, and it was really cool. There were a lot of big, tough dudes,
Mhm.
um, that I knew. I mean, like hardcore guys that were reduced to tears, man. You can't hear some of those things and see some of those things. And I will say this, Tupac has amazing training in how to deal with these things, how to process. It's mandatory after every court appearance. You huddle up and do a debrief to make sure everybody's okay. They're really, really good at it. And lots of training constantly. We're constantly having to take these online courses and trainings and do them in person, and everything else to know how to enter the courtroom and how to deal with it and grief, what to do, what not to do, what you can say, don't say, don't talk to media, don't do, anything that would jeopardize what the legal process was trying to do to help support these kids. And so it's a really good organization, man.
Yeah, I mean, then there's an opportunity to donate. So, people want to support in that way. And yeah, thank you so much for this. We haven't even talked about your expertise. That'll be on next week. We're going to talk about your whole longevity clinic that is coming in Mexico and your experience there. But I really wanted to get people a sense of the man, and it seemed like difficult to put this all into one episode. So I really appreciate that you're willing to take the time to do two. Really meaningful conversation for me. A lot of things just come up for me that I learn, just even as
Yeah,
I'm,
I love it.
hearing, I've thought about this story a lot, but you hear it again and then you learn different things, and I'm hopeful that that's true for my people. We're here every Wednesday, The Neuro's Journey. Thanks so much for listening. Please, subscribe. That's the number one thing you can do to make this work get out there more. And thank you so much, Greg. I appreciate you, and
Thank you.
I'll see you next week too.
Thanks so much.